By late 1943, the Pacific Ocean had become Japan's most dangerous battlefield. The Imperial Navy, once dominant and feared, was now bleeding slowly beneath the surface. Its proud fleet still fought in distant seas, but its heart, the merchant convoys that carried oil, iron, rice, and men from the colonies, had become targets for a new kind of warfare. The war's tide had shifted. America's submarines, once plagued by faulty torpedoes and poor coordination, were now the silent predators of the Pacific. They hunted not for glory, but for starvation, the starvation of an empire. Every day, Japanese ships left ports in Singapore, Borneo, and the Dutch East Indies, loaded with the vital fuel that kept aircraft flying and destroyers moving. Each voyage north to the home islands was a test of fate. Beneath those long routes lurked American submarines, waiting like ghosts, guided by radar, radio intercepts, and patience. The ocean had become a trap, invisible yet absolute. Japan's wartime economy depended entirely on the sea. Its industry produced weapons only if convoys reached the factories. Its soldiers fought only if supplies reached the islands. When oil convoys stopped, engines stopped. When food convoys sank, morale broke. The Imperial Navy knew this truth, but it had no solution. Escort ships were too few, their sonar primitive, and their depth charges often ineffective. The empire had stretched too far, too fast, and now every ton of steel that left its ports risked never returning. By the autumn of 1943, Allied codebreakers in Pearl Harbor and Brisbane had mapped Japan's trade routes with remarkable accuracy. Each intercepted radio transmission, each decoded convoy order, became a death sentence for ships that didn't yet know they were being hunted. American submariners studied these reports before each patrol. They learned where tankers traveled, where troop ships gathered, and which sea lanes were most crowded. To the crews of those submarines, the Pacific was not an endless wilderness. It was a map of opportunities. The transformation of the U.S. submarine force had been hard won. Early in the war, frustration had nearly broken morale. Torpedoes ran too deep or failed to explode. Targets were missed, and commanders were blamed. But by 1943, those problems were solved. The Mark 18 electric torpedo arrived, its wake invisible and its impact deadly. New radar systems allowed subs to track targets even at night or through rain. Training improved. Young, aggressive commanders replaced the cautious ones. They were told, "Sink ships, not schedules." And they did. Japan, meanwhile, underestimated the threat. Its admirals still believed in decisive surface battles, the kind fought by battleships and carriers. Submarines, in their view, were defensive weapons. They rarely coordinated convoys with air cover, and their escort doctrine remained outdated. Even when convoys were formed, the merchant ships often sailed in loose columns, unprotected by sonar-equipped escorts. Each attack became a massacre waiting to happen. In early 1944, U.S. submarines sank ships faster than Japan could replace them. The effect was catastrophic but quiet. Tokyo's newspapers did not report the losses. They spoke instead of victory and honor. But within the Imperial Navy, reports of missing convoys spread fear. Admirals began to realize they were losing not just ships, but the war itself, one torpedo at a time. Among those American submarines was one destined to strike a blow so devastating that even hardened Japanese officers would weep at its outcome. It was small, silent, and manned by just 70 men. Yet its actions would destroy an entire convoy in a single night. Its name would be whispered among submariners as legend, a symbol of how the Pacific's balance of power had shifted from the surface to the depths. The stage was set in the Western Pacific, along Japan's vital lifeline routes between the Dutch East Indies and Formosa. Convoy traffic increased as the empire grew desperate to move fuel and ore north before American fleets advanced further. The Japanese knew the Americans were hunting them, but they had no choice. Every delay meant a factory shutting down, an airfield left without fuel, or a ship stranded in harbor. The Empire's arteries had to keep flowing, even if every voyage became a gamble with death. And so, one convoy, large, valuable, and heavily loaded, began its journey under the cover of darkness. Its captains hoped to slip through the danger zone unscathed. They trusted their escorts, their training, and the gods of the sea. But beneath those same waves, an American submarine was already listening, already tracking, and already closing in. The submarine that waited beneath the convoy's route was one of the most lethal weapons the United States Navy had ever unleashed. Sleek, narrow, and armed with 24 torpedoes, it was a machine built for stealth and precision. Her name was USS Tang, commanded by a man whose courage and instincts would soon make him a legend, Commander Richard H. O'Kane. Before Tang, O'Kane had served as the executive officer aboard USS Wahoo under the famed Dudley "Mush" Morton, one of the deadliest American skippers of the war. From Morton, he learned the art of aggression. To attack boldly, close the range, and strike without hesitation. When O'Kane received command of his own submarine in 1943, he turned that philosophy into practice with deadly perfection. By mid-1944, Tang had already destroyed convoys across the Philippine Sea and the East China Sea. Her crew worked like clockwork, moving silently through darkness, listening to the faint hum of distant engines. The men were young, most in their 20s, but disciplined beyond their years. They slept in narrow bunks beside torpedoes, breathed recycled air, and lived in constant tension. Each dive could be their last. Yet they believed in their captain, a calm man with a sharp gaze and an unshakable sense of timing. Japan's convoy system, by then, was stretched thin and desperate. Losses had become unbearable. In 1944 alone, more than 1,000 Japanese merchant ships had been sunk. Each one carried either soldiers, oil, or food, all irreplaceable. The Imperial Navy attempted to form larger convoys, hoping that numbers and escorts would increase survival chances. But that strategy only concentrated their targets. American submarines preferred large groups. More ships meant more opportunities when radar contact revealed a convoy's position. Submariners planned coordinated attacks, slipping in from the flanks and firing spreads of torpedoes into the clustered ships. The Japanese escorts, though brave, were poorly equipped. Most destroyers lacked modern sonar. They carried limited depth charges and often relied on guesswork. Anti-submarine aircraft were rare in remote sea lanes, leaving vast areas undefended. Japanese commanders often underestimated radar technology, unaware that American submarines could track them at night even beyond visual range. By the time an escort detected a submarine, it was usually too late. On the night that would enter naval history, Tang was patrolling the Formosa Strait, a narrow and treacherous passage between the Philippines and Taiwan. It was one of Japan's busiest and most dangerous convoy routes. O'Kane's orders were clear: attack anything carrying oil or troops. His crew monitored the radar screen constantly. Just before midnight, faint echoes appeared. Multiple targets, moving slowly in a straight line. A large convoy. It was exactly what they had been waiting for. Above the surface, the Japanese convoy pushed northward. Around a dozen ships, tankers, transports, and freighters, escorted by several destroyers and patrol vessels. The cargo included aviation fuel and supplies for the defense of the Philippines. Japanese intelligence had reported increased submarine activity in the area, but the convoy's commanders believed they could make it through by maintaining tight formation and speed. They could not have known that O'Kane and his men were already tracking them from beyond the horizon, closing the distance with deadly patience. The sea that night was calm, offering no shelter for sound or movement. The Tang submerged to periscope depth. O'Kane studied the convoy's formation, identifying the lead and trailing ships. His plan was to strike deep into the heart of the column, where panic would spread fastest. The torpedo data computer was set, firing angles calculated. The crew waited, silent, every heartbeat matching the hum of the engines. The significance of that single encounter went far beyond one battle. By 1944, Japan's defeat was already visible, not in its cities or on its battlefields, but beneath the ocean. Each submarine patrol was part of a broader campaign that strangled Japan's war economy. Without fuel from Borneo and the East Indies, its aircraft could not fly. Without steel and food, its factories and armies would collapse. Every convoy destroyed brought the empire closer to starvation. In Tokyo, reports of missing ships arrived daily. Admirals ordered stricter communication discipline, but it made no difference. The convoys still vanished. The phrase "unseen enemy" began circulating through Japanese command circles. They had learned to fear the silence between radio calls, silence that often meant an entire fleet was gone. And soon, in the dark waters of the Formosa Strait, another silence would fall. One so devastating that even seasoned admirals would struggle to comprehend it. The stage was set for a single submarine to rewrite the balance of power beneath the Pacific. Life aboard a submarine was a strange blend of silence, fear, and routine. The men of USS Tang lived in a world of constant tension, surrounded by machinery that could crush them at any moment. There was no sunrise or sunset below the waves, only the rhythm of shifts and the metallic hum of engines. Every space smelled of oil, metal, and sweat. The temperature shifted with depth, hot and suffocating near the surface, cold and damp during deep dives. Yet in those cramped steel corridors, camaraderie was unbreakable. Each man knew the habits, voice, and heartbeat of the others. Survival depended on trust. They worked as one organism. The sonar man's ear guided the helmsman's hand. The torpedo man's calculations determined the captain's command. Silence was their weapon. Laughter was rare. But when it came, it broke the tension like sunlight through fog. These young men carried photographs of wives, fiancés, or sweethearts tucked into their lockers. Letters from home were read until the paper faded. Between attacks, they listened to faint radio music, a fragile reminder of the world above. The war outside was vast and violent, but inside the submarine, it was measured in whispers and heartbeats. For the Japanese sailors above them, life at sea was a different kind of terror. Convoys had once been symbols of safety, large fleets moving together for protection. By 1944, they had become floating targets. Merchant ships carried supplies essential to the empire's survival, yet most crews were civilians, fishermen, traders, or conscripted laborers. They were poorly trained and rarely informed of danger until it struck. Anti-submarine drills were minimal. When depth charges exploded nearby, panic spread quickly. Few had seen submarines, but everyone feared them. Stories circulated among merchant crews of ships disappearing without warning, of seas boiling with fire, and of men and dying before they even knew they were under attack. To the Japanese escorts, defending these convoys was both duty and despair. Their equipment lagged behind the enemy's technology. Sonar often malfunctioned. Radar was unreliable. Some ships carried outdated hydrophones from the 1930s. Escort commanders worked without rest, scanning endless horizons, aware that the next minute could bring a torpedo they would never see. When they did detect an enemy, the counterattack was frantic. Depth charges rolled into the sea like thunder, their blasts shaking every hull. Yet more often than not, the ocean swallowed their fury, and the submarine slipped away untouched. For American submariners, this imbalance of fear was deliberate. They learned to exploit it. The Pacific War under the waves was psychological as much as physical. Commanders like O'Kane knew that panic could break discipline faster than firepower. A perfectly timed torpedo spread could paralyze an entire convoy. When the first explosion struck, merchant captains scattered, breaking formation and exposing themselves to more attacks. Each man aboard Tang knew the strategy: strike fast, disappear, and strike again before the enemy could recover. But behind the tactical success lay the human cost. Every explosion they heard meant men dying above. The crew of Tang did not celebrate blindly. They were soldiers executing orders, but they were also witnesses to destruction on an unimaginable scale. Through the periscope, O'Kane often saw figures leaping from burning ships, clinging to debris, their cries lost in the roar of fire. He never forgot those sights. In his post-war writings, he described them not with triumph, but with gravity, as the unavoidable tragedy of war. Japan's convoy sailors faced horror without glory. Their losses were among the highest of the war. Tens of thousands died at sea, often unrecorded. Entire ships disappeared without survivors. Families back home received only silence, official notices reading, "Missing at sea." The Imperial Navy honored its combat fleets, but few remembered the merchant crews who fed and fueled them. They became ghosts of an empire that could no longer sustain itself. As American submarines perfected their craft, Japanese morale collapsed. Convoy routes that once bustled with activity now lay empty. Shipyards could not build replacements fast enough. Each voyage became a mission of desperation. In Japanese naval schools, instructors still taught outdated tactics. Inexperienced captains led convoys without proper coordination, relying on superstition and courage. They hung Shinto charms on the bridge and prayed to the sea gods for safety. Yet the gods were silent. Beneath them, technology, mathematics, and human determination had taken control. O'Kane understood the enemy's weakness better than most. He had studied Japanese naval habits, convoy spacing, and maneuvering tendencies. He knew that Japanese ships tended to zigzag predictably after attacks, and that escorts often focused on protecting the flagship, leaving others exposed. He exploited every detail. His attacks were not random. They were chess moves played in darkness. Tang's crew called him the Calm Storm. He never raised his voice, never rushed. His eyes told them everything. When he whispered, "Fire," it felt like history itself holding its breath. By the autumn of 1944, Tang had already sunk dozens of ships. Each patrol report added new tonnage, new victories, new scars. But this next encounter would surpass them all, not just for its destruction, but for its psychological impact. The Japanese admirals in Tokyo, already weary from months of grim reports, would read the news and feel something they had not felt before. Despair. For the first time, they would weep not just for ships, but for the realization that the ocean, once their empire's greatest strength, had turned against them. Beneath the moonless sea, the submarine adjusted its course. The men inside checked instruments, loaded torpedoes, and prepared for battle. They did not know yet what the night would bring, only that the enemy was near, and that duty demanded silence until the right moment came. Technology had become the invisible hand that shaped every move beneath the sea. By 1944, the American submarine fleet had turned science into strategy. The once clumsy torpedoes that often failed in 1942 were now precise instruments of death. The Mark 18 electric torpedo left no wake, its battery-powered engine silent and smokeless. The Mark 23 steam torpedo, though faster, produced a visible trail of bubbles, useful for daylight attacks where speed mattered most. Every commander chose carefully which to use. O'Kane preferred precision over spectacle. He trusted the electric models, firing them in calculated spreads to blanket entire formations. Tang also carried a new generation of radar, the SJ Surface Search Set, which could detect ships far beyond visual range. Combined with radar-assisted plotting and the new TDC, Torpedo Data Computer, a mechanical analog brain, O'Kane could strike targets he could barely see. These machines allowed a small submarine to act like a wolf among sheep. The Japanese never truly understood how invisible their enemy had become. In contrast, Japan's technology lagged tragically behind. Their sonar systems, often imported from pre-war Germany, were unreliable in tropical waters. Their radar, where available, suffered from poor training and maintenance. Japanese escort commanders relied mostly on eyesight and intuition, methods doomed in the vast Pacific nights. The Imperial Navy had been designed for decisive fleet engagements, not convoy protection. The resources poured into battleships like Yamato might have saved hundreds of merchantmen if spent instead on escort ships and detection gear. By 1944, that mistake had become fatal. But even advanced machines required human nerve. Tang's technological advantage was nothing without O'Kane's mind behind it. He was known for a daring tactic few others attempted: surface night attacks inside the convoy formation. Instead of firing from a safe distance, he would slip between enemy ships under the cover of darkness, running on the surface at high speed, firing torpedoes point blank before diving again. It was the naval equivalent of charging into enemy lines with eyes open. Such tactics demanded perfect timing, courage, and calm under pressure. Most commanders avoided the risk of collision or discovery. O'Kane embraced it. His approach turned warfare into art. A convoy scattered by confusion was easier prey than one that stayed organized. Each torpedo's explosion created chaos. Searchlights swept the sea. Escorts veered off course, and ships collided in panic. Amid that chaos, Tang vanished, silent, patient, deadly. The sea itself became O'Kane's ally, a stage for precision and terror. The tactical brilliance of these attacks was undeniable, but their moral gravity was heavy. Submarine warfare blurred the line between combat and annihilation. Merchant ships carried vital supplies, but also human lives: cooks, engineers, civilians forced into service. Submariners rarely saw the faces of those they killed, but they felt the weight of it. Some men aboard Tang avoided looking through the periscope after the torpedoes hit, unwilling to witness what came next. Others rationalized it as necessary. If Japan's convoys lived, more Allied soldiers would die elsewhere. In the logic of total war, mercy had no place beneath the waves. O'Kane, though unshaken in command, often reflected on what he saw. He once wrote that war at sea was a silence filled with consequence. His duty demanded ruthlessness, but his humanity never vanished. Those who served with him recalled how he spoke quietly after successful attacks, never cheering, never boasting. He treated victory as responsibility, not triumph. That restraint defined the best submariners. Killers by duty, not by desire. On the Japanese side, defeat at sea carried humiliation deeper than loss itself. The Imperial Navy's creed valued honor and endurance above survival. Merchant sailors who abandoned ship were often stigmatized, even though most had no choice. Survivors drifted for days, clinging to wreckage, watching comrades vanish beneath oil-slicked waters. Japanese culture prized stoicism. Few spoke of their suffering afterward. But in private diaries recovered after the war, words of grief appeared again and again. Despair not only for lost ships, but for the feeling that the ocean itself had betrayed them. Among Japan's admirals, the growing realization was unbearable. Each new convoy report read like a eulogy. Tankers gone, escorts missing, hundreds drowned. The Empire's heart, its oil lifeline from Borneo and the East Indies, was bleeding out faster than it could be replenished. In naval meetings, arguments flared. Some demanded massive air patrols. Others called for rerouting through safer waters. None of it mattered. The Americans always found them. In the months leading to Tang's most famous patrol, a chilling truth settled across the Imperial Navy. They no longer controlled the Pacific. Their fleets still floated. Their bases still stood, but the sea lanes connecting them were vanishing. An admiral was quoted saying, "We have battleships without fuel and islands without food." The ocean that once promised power had turned into a prison. For O'Kane and his men, that same ocean was opportunity and danger intertwined. They respected it, feared it, and lived inside its moods. Every patrol was a test of endurance. They fought the elements as much as the enemy. Tropical heat that made the air unbreathable. Depth charge blasts that rattled bones, weeks without sunlight. Yet the men kept going, driven not by hate, but by purpose. They believed that ending Japan's convoys meant ending the war sooner. That belief carried them into the final hunt. The convoy now ahead of them was large, vital, and completely unaware. O'Kane studied its pattern, the gaps between ships, the behavior of escorts. He saw weakness where others saw strength. Beneath the dark sky, he prepared to strike with every weapon, every ounce of precision he had learned since the war began. Above, Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon, their eyes straining against the Black Sea. They saw nothing. No wake, no shadow, no sign of the predator already among them. Within hours, history would remember this night as the moment when a single submarine inside the submarine, the red emergency lights bathed the control room in an eerie glow. The crew spoke in whispers, their movements deliberate and rehearsed. Commander Richard O'Kane stood at the periscope, his expression steady. The sonar man's voice broke the silence. Multiple screws. Bearing 080, range closing. O'Kane nodded. The convoy was moving directly toward them. He ordered the boat to periscope depth. The engines slowed. Metal groaned softly as the submarine adjusted trim. Through the narrow scope, faint silhouettes emerged. Dark hulls against darker water. The hunt was on. O'Kane's voice was calm, almost quiet. Flood tubes 1 through 6. The torpedo men moved instantly, their hands practiced, faces gleaming with sweat. The submarine's brain, the torpedo data computer, clicked and whirred as bearings were entered. Numbers translated into death. Every degree of angle, every knot of speed mattered. At such short range, even a single miscalculation could mean a miss. Or discovery. Above them, the convoy plowed forward, unaware. Japanese officers on the bridge of the lead freighter discussed arrival schedules, unaware that they had already entered the crosshairs of history. In the engine rooms, stokers shoveled coal and oilers checked pressure gauges, performing the routine motions of survival. The escorts had reported no enemy contact. The sea seemed safe. O'Kane waited. He wanted the convoy to move closer, deep enough into his trap to ensure chaos when he struck. The range closed to under 1,000 yards, point blank. His plan was to hit the center ships first, splitting the convoy's formation, forcing the escorts to scatter. Then, he would surface and fire again. It was a strategy of speed and shock, one he had perfected through months of combat. "Set depth 10 feet, he ordered. "Spread salvo. Stand by." The seconds stretched into eternity. Why? The helmsman wiped sweat from his brow. The boat was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. Then, O'Kane whispered the single word that would seal the fate of hundreds of men above. "Fire!" The Tang shuddered as 6 torpedoes left their tubes, streaking into the dark sea. Seconds later, the sonar erupted with echoes, the sound of destruction racing away. The crew held their breath. Then, it came. The distant boom of explosions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each impact lighting up the horizon. The ocean surface burst into flame. A tanker carrying aviation fuel vanished in a single eruption that tore the night apart. The shockwave rolled through the submarine, rattling bolts and instruments. Men grinned in silence, not out of joy, but out of awe at the power unleashed. On the surface, panic spread like wildfire. Japanese sailors screamed orders. Signal lamps flashed wildly across the convoy. Ships broke formation, colliding in their desperate attempts to evade the unseen enemy. The escorts turned their searchlights in all directions, but the beams revealed only chaos. Burning wreckage, drifting oil, men in the water. In the confusion, the Tang had already reloaded and repositioned. O'Kane ordered the boat to surface. The engines roared as Tang broke through the surface waves like a predator leaping from darkness. The bridge hatch opened and O'Kane climbed into the night air, scanning the inferno ahead. Flames reflected off his binoculars. He saw the silhouettes of ships turning, trying to flee. He gave the order. All ahead flank. Prepare aft tubes. Tang raced directly into the convoy's heart, weaving between sinking ships, its deck awash in the glow of fire. Fire aft! The next salvo thundered. Another explosion tore through a freighter's side, breaking it in two. Oil slicks spread across the sea, igniting in streaks of light. Men clung to debris, shouting prayers that vanished in the roar of combustion. The convoy had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Within minutes, half its ships were gone. The escorts, unable to find the submarine's position amid the flames, fired wildly. Depth charges exploded in the wrong places. O'Kane maneuvered through the wreckage, firing his remaining torpedoes one by one, each strike precise and devastating. From the bridge of one surviving destroyer, a Japanese officer watched helplessly as ship after ship disappeared. The ocean was covered in oil and bodies. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. He later recalled the scene was like the end of the world. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere was electric but controlled. The crew worked without words, loading, firing, diving again. O'Kane's calm voice cut through the tension like a metronome of destruction. Above them, Japan's lifeline burned. By 3 a.m., the sea had turned into a floating inferno. The Tang withdrew into deeper water, undetected, its mission complete. The men sat silently, exhausted. They knew what they had done. Through the periscope, O'Kane took one last look at the burning horizon. He said nothing. The convoy that had carried the Empire's hopes now drifted as ruins. And yet, the night was not over. Tang still had torpedoes, and fate would demand one final shot before dawn. The horizon was still burning when the USS Tang submerged again to reload its final torpedoes. The men were weary, their faces streaked with sweat and grime, yet their movements stayed sharp. They had struck a devastating blow, sinking nearly every ship in the convoy. But Commander Richard O'Kane was not done. Reports showed one last crippled freighter attempting to limp toward the coast under escort. It was a target too valuable to ignore. In the dim red light of the control room, O'Kane studied the plotting board. His hand traced the convoy's remnants. 2 scattered escorts, a burning transport, and 1 cargo vessel still afloat. He knew that finishing them would cripple Japan's supply chain across the East China Sea. Every ship destroyed meant less fuel, fewer weapons, fewer chances for the Imperial Navy to recover. The Tang's success had become more than a mission. It was a statement that America's silent service ruled the Pacific's dark waters. The order came softly. Bring her to periscope depth. The submarine ascended through layers of cold seawater. The hull creaked under pressure. O'Kane raised the periscope and scanned the burning wrecks. Through the haze, he spotted the last freighter. Its hull blackened, its bow dipping. He adjusted the lens, measuring distance and angle. It was less than 900 yards away. Close, dangerously close. He knew the risk, but he trusted his calculations. Tubes 1 and 2 ready, came the report. O'Kane nodded. The men stood silently, waiting for his signal. The air was heavy, the only sound the soft hum of machinery and the occasional creak of metal under strain. Then, as before, O'Kane gave the command. Fire 1! Fire 2! 2 torpedoes shot out, leaving trails of compressed air behind them. The submarine tilted slightly from the recoil. The seconds that followed were eternal. Then came the explosion, a deep, hollow roar that reverberated through the sea. The freighter split open midships, fire spilling across the surface. Its stern lifted briefly before plunging beneath the waves. The Tang's crew erupted in quiet triumph. They had destroyed the last ship of the convoy. The Japanese convoy that had departed Formosa with pride and confidence was gone. Every transport, every tanker, sunk. Hundreds of sailors and soldiers perished in the dark, their cries fading with the hiss of steam and flame. The few survivors clung to wreckage, watching helplessly as the submarine slipped back into the depths. Inside Tang, O'Kane allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. The boat had fired all 24 torpedoes of its loadout. It was a record of destruction unmatched in the Pacific War. The crew exchanged exhausted smiles. For them, the night's battle was over. They had done their duty, struck a blow that would echo across the empire. All that remained was the long voyage home. O'Kane decided to surface one last time before dawn to assess the damage and mark coordinates for the record. The submarine rose slowly, breaking through the smoke-stained water. The sea around them glowed faintly with reflected firelight, the remnants of burning oil drifting across the surface. On that, a bridge. The men inhaled the acrid scent of fuel and salt. It was over. "Prepare to fire the last torpedo," O'Kane ordered quietly. There was one more left, loaded in the stern tube. He intended to destroy any lingering wreckage that could serve as navigation reference for Japanese rescuers. It was a cleanup shot, routine and calculated. The crew obeyed without hesitation. The final torpedo was armed and ready. O'Kane aimed carefully, aligning the scope toward a burning freighter that still floated stubbornly. "Set depth 10 feet, he said. "Fire when ready." The command was executed. The torpedo slid from the tube and disappeared beneath the waves. O'Kane stepped back, satisfied. But within seconds, the soundman's voice broke the calm. "Sir, erratic bearing. She's turning back." Before anyone could react, the torpedo, a Mark 18 electric model, malfunctioned. Instead of running straight, it curved in a deadly arc, circling back toward its own launch point. The crew froze. The sonar operator shouted, "Contact closing fast. Range decreasing." O'Kane's voice rose sharply. "All ahead flank. Hard right rudder." The engines roared, but it was too late. The returning torpedo struck Tang's stern. The explosion ripped through the submarine like a hammer of fate. The deck heaved, lights flickered out, and men were thrown from their stations. The control room filled instantly with smoke and oil vapor. Bulkheads buckled under pressure. The submarine pitched upward, then plunged violently downward. In seconds, the Tang, America's deadliest submarine, became a wreck. Water surged through ruptured compartments. Men screamed orders no one could hear. O'Kane tried to steady himself, shouting for damage control, but the aft section was gone. The torpedo had hit directly beneath the conning tower. The submarine sank fast, spiraling as compartments flooded. Inside the chaos, discipline remained. Trained instinct took over. Men sealed hatches, rigged escape gear, tried to equalize pressure. But the sea was merciless. Depth gauges spun wildly as Tang descended past 180 feet, then 200. Metal screamed. Then, miraculously, the descent stopped. Tang had come to rest on the seabed, tilted at a deadly angle. Silence returned. The terrible silence of the deep. The surviving crew counted themselves. Out of the 87 men aboard, only a handful were alive. They huddled in the forward compartments, trapped in darkness. O'Kane moved through the wreckage, helping those he could. His face was streaked with oil, his uniform torn. He knew the truth. Escape was almost impossible. Hours passed. Using the submarine's emergency air supply and escape gear, O'Kane and a few men managed to reach the surface through the forward torpedo room's escape trunk. One by one, they emerged into the night, gasping for air. Around them, the wreckage of the convoy still burned. A sea of flame over a graveyard of ships. They floated among debris and bodies, waiting for dawn. When the Japanese destroyers returned to search for survivors, they found the men of Tang. O'Kane and 8 others were rescued, not by allies, but by the very enemy they had just destroyed. The irony was brutal. The officers on the Japanese ships could scarcely believe it. They had watched one submarine annihilate an entire convoy. And now, its commander floated among the wreckage of his own making. In the silence that followed, even hardened Japanese sailors felt something shift inside. They bowed their heads, realizing that the Empire's might could be undone by one man's precision and courage, and by the cruel randomness of war itself. Dawn broke over the South China Sea with a pale, smoky light. The ocean was still burning. Oil slicks stretched for miles, reflecting the orange embers of dying fires. Broken lifeboats drifted among charred debris, the silent remnants of a vanished fleet. Seabirds circled low, their cries lost in the hiss of escaping steam. What had begun as a convoy of proud ships carrying the lifeblood of an empire now floated as ash and ruin. For the Japanese Navy, the loss was catastrophic. 13 ships had sailed from Formosa. None would return. Over 10,000 tons of supplies, vehicles, fuel, and ammunition were gone, swallowed by the sea. The escorts, too, had been crippled, their crews exhausted from the futile search for survivors. The Imperial Command received the report in disbelief. One submarine, just one, had destroyed an entire convoy. The words carried humiliation beyond measure. At the heart of it was Commander Richard O'Kane, now a prisoner aboard a Japanese destroyer. His face was bruised, his uniform shredded, but his composure remained intact. When interrogated, he refused to speak beyond confirming his name and rank. The Japanese officers recognized him immediately. They had heard the stories. Tang had been the most feared hunter of the Pacific, a vessel whose sinkings had paralyzed Japanese logistics from the Marianas to the Formosa Strait. Now, its commander stood before them, soaked in oil and seawater, watching the burning horizon where his victims still floated. But even in Convoy 3 would cripple their fuel supply to the Philippines, just as the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf began. Without those tankers, Japanese aircraft and warships were left stranded, unable to maneuver or retreat effectively. O'Kane's attack had not only sunk ships, it had struck the Empire's arteries at the worst possible moment. For the survivors, the days that followed were a slow descent into despair. The rescued sailors of Tang were separated and interrogated harshly. They were beaten, starved, and held in cramped cells on Formosa before being transferred to Japan. Out of the 87 men who had served aboard the Tang, only 9 lived to see the war's end. The rest were lost, either in the explosion, trapped inside the submarine, or perished during captivity. O'Kane, meanwhile, endured isolation with the same discipline that had guided him in command. Fellow prisoners later recalled his quiet strength, his refusal to show defeat. He carried himself, one said, as though he were still the captain of a ship. And in a way, he was. Even behind bars, O'Kane represented something that could not be sunk. The will to fight in silence, the courage to strike from beneath the waves. The Japanese officers who had captured him could not forget what they had witnessed. In private, several admitted feeling both hatred and admiration. One recalled that, as the fires of the convoy burned through the night, an older officer stood at the rail, watching the flames reflected in the water. "That man fought like a god beneath the sea," he said quietly. "We have lost the war of spirits." In Tokyo, news of the loss spread through naval headquarters like a wound. The convoy system that once carried fuel and steel across the Empire's waters was collapsing. Each route to the home islands was now a graveyard patrolled by American submarines. Tang's victory, and its destruction, became a symbol of both mastery and mortality in submarine warfare. Back in Pearl Harbor, weeks passed before Tang was listed as missing in action. Families waited for news that never came. Only after the war would the truth emerge, told through O'Kane's own recollections and Japanese records. The story of Tang's last patrol became a legend, not for its tragedy alone, but for the audacity of one crew that changed the balance of an ocean. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, now faced the unthinkable. Its merchant fleet destroyed, its supply lines severed, and its sailors haunted by the memory of one submarine that had fought until it destroyed itself. And as word of Tang's final battle reached the prisoners' camps and command offices alike, one question began to echo through every corridor of power. How could a single American submarine bring an empire's convoys to their knees? The answer lay not only in steel and torpedoes, but in the minds of those who commanded them. By 1944, American submarine warfare had evolved into a precise science of destruction. Radar, sonar, and the revolutionary torpedo data computer gave U.S. submariners an unmatched edge. Yet it was the leadership, men like Richard O'Kane, that turned machines into instruments of strategic collapse. Tang's patrols had rewritten the rules of undersea warfare. Her final battle proved that precision, daring, and timing could do what fleets of battleships could not. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff pored over the convoy's loss reports in disbelief. Each sinking was listed in painful detail. The Kogane Maru, Josan Maru, Oita Maru, Eishin Maru, Mikage Maru. All gone. The reports read like an obituary of Japan's wartime industry. The empire had no reserves left to replace them. Shipyards were in ruins, fuel was scarce, and merchant crews were dying faster than they could be trained. The admiral overseeing logistics, Vice Admiral Teijiro Toyoda, later admitted that by late 1944, the sea itself had turned against us. In the weeks following the convoy disaster, surviving Japanese officers were summoned to debrief. Exhaustion, years of war, endless convoys, and constant fear had culminated in a single night of annihilation. Their faith in the empire's invincibility cracked. For the first time, they began to understand that defeat was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Japanese records described the reaction among senior admirals as a silence more terrible than any outburst. One officer wrote in his diary that after reading the loss report, Admiral Soemu Toyoda closed the file, stood up, and walked to the window without speaking for nearly 10 minutes. Then, in a low voice, he said, "If one enemy submarine can do this, what remains of our sea power?" The psychological effect was immense. The Imperial Navy had once ruled the Pacific with unshakable confidence, but now its surviving officers faced a truth too heavy to bear, that the ocean they had dominated was no longer theirs. Each convoy that left Japan did so in fear, each captain knowing that somewhere below, unseen and silent, an American submarine might be waiting. For the United States Navy, the Tang's last patrol became both triumph and tragedy. O'Kane's capture was a devastating loss to his men, but his record spoke louder than any victory parade. In just 5 patrols, Tang had sunk 33 Japanese ships, totaling more than 116,000 tons, the highest confirmed tonnage by any American submarine in history. The Navy honored her as one of the most successful submarines ever commissioned. When the news of Tang's fate finally reached home, it was met with both grief and pride. The families of her crew received the dreaded telegrams, yet history would soon remember their loved ones as heroes who had turned the tide of war beneath the sea. When the war ended in August 1945, O'Kane and the surviving Tang crew were liberated from the Japanese prison camps. Emaciated, exhausted but unbroken, they returned to a world that, for both nations, it stands as a reminder of the price of mastery and the thin line between victory and ruin. The war had turned decisively after that night. The empire that once spanned oceans was crumbling, its roots choked with ghosts. And in the silence that followed, the world began to ask a deeper question. What kind of courage drives men to fight beneath the waves, knowing that the ocean might take them too? Shall I now write the reflection/closure, around 350-400 words, to complete the 7,000 to 8,000 word documentary script? The sea remembers. Long after the guns fell silent and the empires faded, the waters of the Formosa Strait still hold their secrets. Beneath the waves, the wreck of the USS Tang lies twisted and silent, surrounded by the remains of the Japanese convoy it destroyed. No monuments rise there, no flags wave above it, only the endless rhythm of the ocean, washing over the rusted steel and the memories of men who fought and died far from home. For Japan, the sinking of that convoy was more than a military defeat. It was the moment the empire's heart stopped beating. Its war machine, built on steel and oil, was cut off from the lifeblood that sustained it. The admirals who once believed in divine victory learned that faith could not keep their ships afloat. In that realization, many wept. Not for themselves, but for the thousands who would never return, and for a nation drifting toward its end. For America, the story of the Tang became one of courage and sacrifice. Commander Richard O'Kane's crew had written their names into naval history, proving that precision and bravery beneath the sea could alter the course of a global war. Their victory came at the highest price, their own destruction. Yet even in tragedy, their mission achieved what fleets and armies could not. They broke the spine of Japan's maritime empire. Years later, O'Kane would visit memorials dedicated to submariners lost at sea. He would stand quietly, gaze at the waves, and speak little. For him, the ocean was both enemy and grave, a place of triumph and loss intertwined. His silence said more than words ever could. War at sea is unlike any other. It is fought not for ground, but for survival, where a single mistake or a single torpedo can decide the fate of nations. The Battle of the Tang and the convoy she destroyed reminds us that beneath every victory lies sacrifice, and beneath every act of valor, the shadow of mortality. The ocean keeps their story now, cold, eternal, and unchanging, a silent witness to the night when one submarine brought an empire to its knees.